Welcome back, and if you're new, thanks for joining. It's another weekly update with the worms, and I am in the middle of harvesting my castings from one of the Vermicomposting totes. It's been, I think it's the second week that I've done the harvest for this one, and in harvesting this way, I find that I get the worms a lot faster. I did try the migration method before with not much success, but using bait trays, I find that I get the worms. So I always check the castings to see if I see a lot of worms in the castings themselves. And when I'm going through the castings this week, I'm noticing that I don't see a lot of worms hanging out in the castings anywhere. So just as a precaution, because 2 weeks does seem a little short, I am going to fill this up for another week, but before I do that, I'm going to flip over to the actual Vermi bag tote where I'm putting the worms to check and see what is going on in there. Since I usually harvest or check in on the castings from harvest mid-week, I typically have some decomposed food that's already in the bait tray. And I don't feed the bins during this time because what's in the tray is enough. So I'm just scooping out everything, checking in it to see the worm population that I got for this week, and then mixing everything in with the existing worms. I can tell that they are getting down to work in the new castings that I've set up because I'm seeing little sprinklings of castings throughout the new bedding material that I created. So things look to be going good in the new bag. I don't see any evidence of any mass exodus around the sides, but I do notice that the edges are crispy, and moisture control is a big issue for me and something I focus on a lot. So I am going to spray this down to get it a little more damp than what it is and not feed this, but I will put some grit over the top and then let this sit for another couple of days before I do the next dump of any material from the baiting. Back over to the harvest tray, I'm making sure to push the castings up against the bait tray so that the worms can just travel a short distance to the food supply. I haven't put any water onto the castings that were harvested. All the food material is just going into the bait tray, and I hope that I only have one more week. So I'm going to fill the bait tray with food that the worms typically enjoy, a lot of food that has a high moisture content, and then cover this with some paper. I ran out of cardboard, I hadn't shredded any, I've been away, so I'm just going to cover this with some paper and then set this to the side again for about 5 days, 5 to 6 days, a little bit less than a week, so that I can make sure that whatever worms are in here I'm capturing and they don't get the opportunity to escape back out the holes. On to the first of the regular totes. To just review, my tote bins do not have any holes at the bottom. I don't do a 2-bin system where one sits in the other. I just have regular totes that have a lid, typically with a hole cut out in the middle for ventilation. But dealing with humidity, I have gone to bubble wrap and just a screen. So as I am going through the castings, the area where I haven't put the food for the previous week, I don't find many worms. And where I've put the food, I have a ton of worms, as evidenced right here. Because these totes seem to be working out pretty well, I've decided that in the totes, I am going to try the migration. I've had no success before, but let's give it another try. So next week I will be harvesting. I do want to give it one more week, but these castings have composted down pretty good, and mostly what you're seeing is the eggshell from the worm grit that I put in. But the seeds I know are not going to break down. There's not a lot of food, so I'm going to give this a small feeding for this week to prep them for next week when I do the migration inside of these bins. But the bins look great. The worms look healthy. I'm really happy with everything with these bins, with the exception for how difficult it was to maintain the moisture in these bins. The second regular tote, oddly enough, is a little more damp than the first one. And again, it always amazes me how they can have the same conditions for the bins, but they still end up being slightly different. So this one, the material was a bit damper than the material that wasn't fed, was a bit damper in this one than the previous one. But again, all of the worms were congregated on the side with the food, which gives me hope that maybe I'll be successful in the migration. There weren't large chunks of food left in this bin either. There really wasn't a lot of evidence of any cardboard left behind. So just like its sister bin, this will be set up for next week to begin the migration inside of the bin. But the worms as well here look happy. It's just that the material in here, it's not a lot. It's not as much as I would have want to harvest. So when I go through and do my bins and restart them for the next cycle, I'm going to also do more additions of cardboard and bedding as I go through, because it does compost down significantly. I don't know if I ever really paid attention to that before, but as I'm doing this and making these video journals, I'm noticing even though I have about half of the bin full, I'm only ending up with like a third of it after the composting cycle has completed. So I'll give this just a little bit of food, and then next week I am excited to start harvesting these bins. So my second Vermi bag tote that I did not harvest because I added cardboard is moving along really well. I'm kind of surprised at how quickly the cardboard is breaking down, but I think I do have a large amount of worms in this particular bin. So I shouldn't be surprised, I guess, but there's worms all throughout the material. And I have been feeding this, instead of pocket feeding it in one side and the other like I'm doing with my regular totes, I have actually been kind of digging a trench and putting the food all throughout, so I find worms all over. This is a large worm ball, a mixture of some of the food and some worms, but again, in this bin, like the other bins, the worms look happy. They are not trying to seek a mass exodus from outside of the bin, and the castings, I find, are more likely to be like the consistency of the brownie or cupcake that is preferred for the castings, or that I prefer, than in the totes. So I'm just collecting the food particles and the worms to place them in the area where I'm going to put the food in this bin. And for this one, it's not going to be harvested next week. with the regular totes. I think it's going to be probably another month before I harvest this one to give it time to break down the casting. So it's going to get its regular size feeding and then set up for another week. Lastly, it is my Vermi Bag Mini. This bag is my favorite bag to fill with castings, but it is my least favorite bag to harvest, and it is my only flow-through system that I have. Now this bin was recently harvested along with one of the Vermi Bag Minis, so my focus right now is on getting the level of the castings back up, as well as trying not to dry the castings out. If you look at the edges, you can see that I have a much larger area of drier cardboard, and that's because I've been adding levels of cardboard, or 2 levels of cardboard each time I feed it, because I am increasing the volume inside the bag. So I'm just trying to mix in the drier material. I am going to spray this down before feeding it, give it a good size feeding, spray it down again, and give it some more cardboard. That way, again, I can slowly increase it week by week instead of trying to just put a large amount of cardboard into the castings and then hoping for the best. With these flow-through systems and with the Vermi bag specifically, they can handle a lot of moisture, but they will tend to run dry if you don't add moisture into them when you're adding a lot of bedding. So with this, I'm just going to make sure it has been sprayed down and moisturized really well before giving it any food. With that said, the worms themselves also are not going for a mass exodus in here. I don't see any worm trails along the side. There weren't a ton of worms that were on the bubble wrap. That makes me believe that the worms are happy with their current circumstances, and I'm not going to veer too much off of what I have planned to do with this bin. And then once they get their regular feeding, it has been set up for the next week. And all of the bags at this point have been updated. I do thank you for sticking to the end of this video. As always, please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.